March 20th, 1602. In the Dutch Republic, something happens that quietly changes the entire structure of global capitalism. 6 competing trading companies are forcibly merged into one single entity. Its name, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie. This is not just a company, it is the first corporation in history legally granted powers normally reserved for states. The right to wage war, the right to build forts, the right to form armies, the right to sign treaties with foreign nations. For the first time in history, a company is no longer just an economic actor. It is a geopolitical force. But to understand why VOC existed, you have to go back to 1500s Europe. At the time, Europe had a strange economic obsession. Food. Not just food, but taste. For centuries, European diets were extremely basic. Salted meat, stale bread, minimal seasoning flavor was not a luxury. It was almost unknown. Then something changed everything. Spices arrived. Spices like black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and most importantly, nutmeg. Nutmeg became the most valuable of them all. In some European markets, it was worth more than gold by weight. It wasn't just considered food. It was believed to have medicinal power, protection against disease, plague, and infection. This belief alone pushed demand to extreme levels. But there was a fundamental problem. Europe did not control spice production. The real source was a small group of islands in Southeast Asia, the Maluku Islands, Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia, and even worse for Europe, the supply chain was controlled by intermediaries. Arab traders, Venetian merchants, Ottoman-controlled trade routes. Every step added cost. Every middleman increased price. And Europe had no direct access. This created a geopolitical pressure that forced exploration. By the late 1400s, Portugal solved part of the problem. They discovered a sea route around Africa, opening direct access to Asia. For the first time, European ships could bypass middlemen. But this was not a monopoly. It was limited access, controlled and unstable. Then in 1580, everything changed again. Spain annexed Portugal. This disrupted global trade networks. And for the Dutch Republic, it became an economic crisis. Dutch merchants who relied on spice re-export suddenly lost access to supply chains. Prices rose, trade routes were blocked, competition collapsed. In response, the Dutch launched direct expeditions. One of the earliest major attempts happened in 1595, led by Cornelis de Houtman, born 1565. He was around 30 years old at the time. His mission was simple. Find a direct route to the Spice Islands and establish trade without intermediaries. But the expedition was deeply flawed. Historical records show outdated navigation charts, inexperienced cruise ships not built for long ocean voyages. The result was predictable: a long, brutal journey across the Indian Ocean. During the voyage, conditions collapsed. Scurvy spread due to vitamin C deficiency, crew mortality increased significantly, discipline broke down under starvation, and disease supplies ran critically low. Many sailors did not survive the journey. Eventually, the expedition reached Indonesia. This was the first direct Dutch contact with the Spice Islands. But trade conditions were not stable. Local kingdoms already had established trade networks and pricing systems. European arrival disrupted this balance. Negotiations were difficult. There were price disputes, mistrust between traders, cultural and language barriers, competition with other European powers. This first expedition was not financially successful, but it achieved something far more important. It confirmed one fact: the Spice Islands were reachable. Between 1598 and 1602, Dutch trading companies began competing aggressively with each other. Instead of cooperation, there was internal rivalry. The consequences were immediate. Prices increased in Asia, profits dropped in Europe, shipping routes became inefficient, competition turned destructive. The system was collapsing under its own structure. To solve this, the Dutch government intervened. On March 20th, 1602, they created a unified monopoly structure, VOC, the Dutch East India Company. This was not a normal corporation. It was a hybrid institution combining government authority, military power, commercial monopoly. It could operate like a state while remaining privately funded. The mission was clear: control the spice trade and eliminate competition. But the implication was far bigger, because now profit was no longer limited to trade. It could also come from territorial control, military enforcement, forced monopolies. This structure created something unprecedented in history, a corporation with the legal right to use violence for profit. And that system would eventually lead to one of the darkest chapters in early global capitalism, the Banda Islands. By 1609, the Dutch East India Company is no longer just testing trade routes. It is now building a permanent presence in Asia. And the man leading this transformation is Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, born in 1587 in the Dutch Republic. He enters VOC service as a young clerk and quickly rises through the ranks. By his early 20s, he is already operating in Asia under the VOC system. But Cohen does not see trade as trade. He sees control. At this point in history, the Spice Island, especially the Banda Islands, are the most valuable real estate on Earth. Why? Because they are the only known source of nutmeg and mace in the world. And nutmeg is not just a spice anymore. It is a global obsession. Used in medicine, used as luxury flavoring, traded like gold per weight. This creates a simple economic reality. Whoever controls Banda controls global spice prices. VOC leadership understands this early. So they move step by step, establish trading posts, build fortified settlements, place military garrisons, pressure local rulers into trade agreements. But there is a problem. The Bandanese people do not accept monopoly control. They have a long-standing trade system where they sell nutmeg to multiple buyers. Chinese traders, Arab merchants, English competitors, Dutch traders. This open market system directly conflicts with VOC's monopoly strategy. So VOC makes a demand. Historical VOC records confirm the policy. They attempted to force exclusive purchasing agreements, meaning all nutmeg must be sold only to the Dutch East India Company at heavily controlled prices. The Bandanese resist, because for them, this destroys their entire trading economy. Tensions escalate through the early 1600s. VOC begins building military infrastructure in the region. One key structure is Fort Nassau, built in Bandanera in 1609. This marks a major shift. The VOC is no longer just trading, it is occupying territory. By 1610s, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen rises into top leadership roles within VOC. He becomes deeply convinced of a strategic idea. To control Asian trade, VOC must eliminate competition completely, not just economically, but physically and politically. This idea becomes central to VOC expansion strategy. In 1621, Cohen is appointed Governor General of the Dutch East Indies. This is the highest VOC position in Asia. He now has command over military forces, trading operations, colonial administration, local enforcement policies. And he immediately focuses on one objective: Banda Islands monopoly enforcement. Because at this point, English traders are still present. Local traders continue independent trade. VOC, monopoly is not secure. From Cohen's perspective, this is a direct threat to profitability. VOC forces enter the Banda Islands in 1621 with a combined military unit. Historical estimates suggest around 1,600 Dutch soldiers, additional Japanese mercenaries hired by VOC. This is no longer a trading mission, it is a military occupation operation. What follows is one of the most controversial events in early corporate history. Historical records confirm large-scale executions of Bandanese leadership, destruction of villages, forced displacement of populations, mass deportations. The VOC goal was not short-term punishment. It was long-term economic control. After 1621, the Banda Islands population is drastically reduced. Survivors are either relocated, forced into labor systems, or replaced by imported enslaved workers from other regions. VOC then restructures the islands into plantation-style production zones. Now the economic system changes completely. VOC achieves what no European company had achieved before: a true global monopoly on nutmeg supply. This allows them to control pricing in Europe. And the financial impact is massive. By mid-1600s, VOC becomes the most valuable corporation in the world at that time. At its peak, historical estimates show 100-plus merchant ships, 40-plus warships, tens of thousands of employees, private military forces across Asia. It operates more like a state than a company. But this success comes with a hidden cost, because VOC is now too large to regulate internally. Corruption increases. Local VOC officials begin private trading, smuggling goods, bypassing official company systems. Even though private trade is officially banned, the system becomes unstable. And yet, from Amsterdam, investors see only one thing: dividends increasing year after year. They are unaware of the full operational reality in Asia. By the late 1600s, VOC is no longer just a spice company. It is now a military empire, a trading monopoly, and a political force across Asia. But every empire built on forced monopoly eventually faces the same problem. Competition returns, markets evolve, and control begins to break. And somewhere in the background, other European powers are watching VOC very carefully, learning from its system, studying its structure, preparing to build their own versions. The age of corporate empires has officially begun, but VOC's peak is also the beginning of its slow decline. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, is no longer an experiment. It is a global empire disguised as a corporation. From Amsterdam to Jakarta, from trading posts to military forts, it controls one of the most valuable trade networks in human history. But this is also the point where something very important begins to happen. Scale starts to become a problem. VOC was designed for expansion, not sustainability. And by the late 1600s, cracks begin to appear inside the system. At its core, VOC has three major problems. First, distance. Amsterdam is thousands of kilometers away from Asia. Communication delays are extreme. Orders can take months to arrive. Decisions are always outdated by the time they are executed. Second, corruption. On paper, VOC is a tightly controlled monopoly. In reality, VOC employees in Asia have enormous freedom. Historical records confirm widespread private trading, smuggling of spices, misuse of company ships for personal profit. The further away from Amsterdam the operations are, the less control the company actually has. Third, internal bureaucracy. VOC is run by a governing body called the Heren 17, the 17 Gentlemen. This group is responsible for decisions across a global empire. But decision-making becomes slow, political, and inefficient. Instead of innovation, the system begins to preserve itself. Meanwhile, something dangerous is happening outside VOC. A new competitor is rising, the English East India Company. Unlike VOC, the English company begins to shift focus. Instead of just spices, they expand into textiles, tea, broader trade systems in India. This diversification slowly weakens VOC's dominance in spice trade. At the same time, VOC faces another silent threat: market saturation and price collapse. The global spice monopoly that once made nutmeg more valuable than gold is no longer as powerful. Why? Because supply control is no longer absolute, and smuggling begins to spread. One of the most important turning points comes in the late 1600s and early 1700s. European powers begin successfully smuggling spice plants out of the Banda system. Nutmeg cultivation spreads beyond VOC-controlled islands. This destroys the core foundation of VOC power: exclusive supply control. As competition increases, VOC responds the only way it knows how: more control, more enforcement, more cost. But this strategy becomes expensive, very expensive. By the 1700s, VOC is still massive on paper. Thousands of employees, ships across oceans, fortified territories in Asia. But financially, the system is weakening. Debt begins to rise. Operational costs increase, and corruption becomes harder to contain. Then comes the final external pressure: war. European geopolitics intensifies, and VOC becomes a target in broader conflicts between European powers. Its ships are attacked, its trade routes are disrupted, and its military costs increase further. By the late 1700s, VOC is no longer profitable. It is surviving on debt. A company that once controlled global spice trade is now financially unstable. Finally, in 1799, the Dutch government officially dissolves the Dutch East India Company. After nearly 200 years of operation, the world's first megacorporation ceases to exist. But the story does not end there. Because VOC's collapse does not erase its impact. It leaves behind global trade networks, colonial infrastructure in Asia, and a blueprint for corporate imperial power. And most importantly, VOC becomes a warning in economic history, a case study of what happens when profit, military power, and monopoly control merge into a single system. But even after dissolution, the legacy continues. The Dutch state takes over VOC territories, and in the 1800s, it introduces systems like the cultivation system, forcing agricultural production in colonized regions, continuing economic exploitation under a new structure. And in Europe, VOC is remembered differently. In Dutch historical memory, it is often described as part of a golden age of trade and maritime success. But modern historical analysis also recognizes forced labor systems, violent monopoly enforcement, and colonial exploitation. Both narratives exist, but they describe the same empire. Final conclusion. The Dutch East India Company was not just a company. It was the first system in history to fully merge capitalism, military force, and state power into one structure. It proved something the world had never seen before, that a corporation could become powerful enough to behave like a nation. But it also proved something else. No monopoly lasts forever, because every system built on control eventually faces the same outcome: competition, corruption, and collapse. VOC, 1602 to 1799, a company that once ruled oceans, ended as history's first corporate failure at global scale.